Nick, here we all are in lockdown, coping with this coronavirus pandemic. And many people around the world are wondering what they can do to help now, but also thinking, what will the world look like once we get through to the other side? And then we have to face, again, all those huge global challenges, climate change, poverty, migration, and indeed widespread conflict. You've just making your own contribution to that effort, publishing the document, A Call to Action. Now that focuses on the aerospace and defense industry. Now, given that its business is developing, manufacturing and selling weapon systems, I'd like you to be able to explain to me what role you see the aerospace and defense sector playing as we try to tackle those huge global challenges.
Well, John, as you know, we are storytellers. I'm a storyteller, but I also have a background in journalism. I was for many years a senior editor at Jane's Defence Weekly, which a number of people will know is a sort of leading military affairs journal. And in that time, I carried out a big I knew the industry, the aerospace and defence industry very well, but I carried out a very big audit of its capabilities right towards the end of my time there. So this was in about 2006-7. And I spotted a bunch of patterns, across these big 9 prime contractors that sit at the top of the supply chain in the Western world. We know many of their names. There's Boeing and Lockheed Martin and BAE Systems. But what I spotted was that, not only is their business much the same, they all make these platforms, ships, guns, tanks, weapon systems, as you say. But below a kind of waterline that you don't commonly see, there is this huge array of capability, science and technology, quite well-developed technology in some cases, that rarely gets deployed. It's because governments do the commissioning of these weapon systems that they typically build. So my thought was, at this time, what if we could find a mechanism to deploy a lot of this science and technology that doesn't get taken up, but a lot of it is very actionable on global challenges, such as climate change, such as food and water security, such as the environment, even down to things like resilient and overcrowded cities. And it got me to wondering, why are these technologies, these capabilities, not deployed? And from that, I really got to where I am today, which was waking up a few weeks ago, in the midst of this coronavirus crisis, thinking, what can I do? What can we do to build a better world after we come out of virus? And my thought to that was, well, let's get this sector, this business industry sector, the aerospace and defense community, to liberate that pool of technical knowledge and know-how against global challenges.
We've seen just recently, as part of the response to the pandemic, the military and working to build field hospitals, which they can do with remarkable ease and efficiency. Likewise, some of the defense sector have been working, switching production to make things like ventilators, etc. But you're talking about there that this huge wealth of technology below the water level, if you like. We only see the tip, the weapon systems, the ships, the aeroplanes, etc. Can you tell me a bit more, what sort of technology might that be, and how you might see it addressing the challenges like water shortages, etc.?
Well, as you say, what we've seen in the last several weeks is the sector addressing a much needed part of the call to action by the medical community, which is, we need more ventilators. And a number of companies aerospace and defense companies have already responded to that challenge. In fact, quite a few across the world. Some of them are really quite well known. Airbus, for example. There's Meggitt here. There's Rolls-Royce, Aero Engines, all responding to this call. But that in itself is just the tip of the iceberg. From all the analysis that we here have carried out and that I've done before, I know that they can deploy to other bigger and better things. For example, if you think of a city, a modern city, a city is as we all know, it's a sort of system of systems. It breaks down into a number of different components. There's the transportation component, there's the safety and security component, there's the energy component, there's a wastewater irrigation component, all of these things. So a city is an interconnected system of systems. This is exactly what huge defense prime contractors like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and BAE Systems build. They build these huge systems of systems architectures. Now, commonly, those architectures are big defensive systems, like a sort of national air defense network, for monitoring airspace and reacting to threats in that airspace. We know that typically. But you can turn that same systems of systems knowledge and expertise, along with a great deal of technology know-how, into better running a city, getting a city to flow and react better to many of the stresses and strains that we have in these huge urban conurbations at the moment. That's just one. Climate is another. Aerospace and defense companies, by the very nature of what they do, know all about climate. They build satellites in orbit. They build submarines and other systems for subsea and everything in between. These guys know about climate, but they're never called upon by governments to deploy that knowledge in or against climate change.
This all sounds fantastic, Nick, and I'm very supportive of the idea, but I'm just thinking that once the world needs to get back working again after the virus has gone away, hopefully, the big companies will want to get their profits going again, to get back into the work that they know they can do, the money they can make. Likewise, governments will want to do the same thing, get the workforces back and get the money coming back into the national coffers. So do you think people are going to listen? Have you had people in the aerospace and defense sector listening to this and saying, yeah, that's interesting, and we would do this, and if so, why they might do that or how they might do it? And likewise, what about the government? Are they interested in making this big shift, which seems to serve everybody so much better than just building, weapons that could be used obviously against humankind?
Well, we started a conversation about this about 10 years ago. And I think the first thing to say is that, this is not, on my part, a swords into plowshares movement. As laudable as that might be, no more conflict. That is a pipe dream that at the moment just wouldn't fly. I think what most, reasonable people would say is that we expect countries to build and deploy things that are sustainable for their defense. They need, we should buy enough systems, capability, defensive systems to protect ourselves as nation states. Where sometimes that can get out of control is in regions of conflict, as you would know, John, only too well, where, for example, you have tinderbox regions that cannot support big influxes of weapon systems because they can be destabilizing. I think it's very healthy for us to look at other sources, additional sources of revenue, to make defense just that, sustainable defense. And if you look at that capability that we've been talking about, this reserve of science and technology below the waterline of what is commonly built and deployed by defense companies, a lot of that technology can go, as we've said, towards solving some of the sources of conflict. For example, it is not beyond the bounds of capability within these companies, aerospace and defense companies, to build and deploy large hospitals for humanitarian causes, as we have seen in London in the last several weeks. But beyond that, they are developing, some of them are developing technologies that might even go into things like desalination plants. Well, if you can get a desalination plant into a tinderbox zone of conflict, what you're doing is you're decreasing the chances of conflict erupting in the first place, because pressures on natural resources are one of the key factors that spark off conflict. So I think there are many things that these companies can do that don't take away their business base. They can actually add to them I mean, there are multiple surveys that show that the global demand for systems and technologies in the global challenges marketplace, think clean tech, for example, is many, many times greater and bigger than the actual defense market itself. So it is a worthy market for these companies to see as adjacent to their business, but in time move more into that adjacent market, make it more core and central to what you do than they would otherwise look on them at the moment. And in so doing, make money, do good and do well out of this. There is one more reason to do this, I think, which is if you were to go to most aerospace and defense companies in the Western world, they would say that they are suffering from a recruitment challenge. Millennials and Generation Z workforce graduates and apprentices are not moving into aerospace and defense in the way that baby boomers like me once did. Why is that? Well, the jury is kind of out, but I think one of the reasons is that defense is really quite opaque. You don't know what you're getting into when you look on it as a career opportunity. On the other hand, adjacent sectors like the tech sector in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, that's actually really very transparent. And I think a lot of Generation Z types with engineering degrees, particularly in software sciences, would see that as a natural place to go and make a career in, rather than in aerospace and defense. Well, what better way to give that generation a sense of purpose than to go, actually, you're not just going to defend your nation, you're going to go and defend the planet. And I think that is very much in time and in tune with, how we all feel right now. After the virus, we want to build a better world. And I can't think of a better way of doing it than that.
You're making a compelling argument for why those big companies would want to make this shift and expand, as you say, their business initially in another direction, and maybe make that new direction the major part of the business, and that it will not only be doing good for the world in general, but will actually encourage people to come and work for them. That sounds brilliant. So at the moment, have you had any feedback? I know you just launched a call to action, but you've been on the edge of the industry as a journo for many years. Is there any feedback at the moment from those companies that yes, we're developing these sorts of technologies, we've certainly got the resources and the stuff below the water to make that even bigger, and we would like to do that? And I wondered what's holding them back, particularly, as you say, it's obviously the zeitgeist that we're all thinking about, particularly about climate change, let alone about poverty and migration, etc., and famine. Would the people who are buying the arms systems and largely promoting them are the governments, whether it's the home government promoting the industry or overseas governments or whichever government actually buying the weapons systems, etc. So do we need to see a shift of political will, if you like, to say, actually, we're spending whatever it was, 14 billion a couple of years ago was the value of the UK arms business. If we can switch that money, which we're paying for, or our governments are paying for, to alternative products and systems, that sounds like the way forward. Do you think there's the will for that?
I think there is a will. I mean, it is, we're just starting down this road, and I don't know. This is an awareness campaign. This is an effort on our part to say, we think that there is a very big underutilized asset out there, which most governments aren't aware of, ironically, even though they, and we, of course, the taxpayer, have paid for and underwritten that vast knowledge base that those aerospace and defense companies are sitting on in terms of their science and technology and know-how. So part of the awareness campaign is trying to get this across to governments that these companies, they operate on a particular business level. Their business model is not like commercial companies, which operate in these typical global challenges spaces. But, those predominantly are things like renewable energy markets, which are very commercially driven. defense and aerospace companies have one customer: governments. And those governments are the people who traditionally they look to for the technology to be pulled through from or via. So we need governments to go, first of all, to recognize that this asset exists. And secondly, to go, for them to start a conversation with these companies and go, how can we stimulate this vast reservoir, this pool of knowledge and capability to do much more than is currently being done in the face of the pandemic, which is fantastic. But how much better would it be to go beyond ventilators, to go beyond the incredible hospital, for example, that's recently been built in London at the Excel Centre by the military, to address some other huge architectural systems of systems challenges that the planet faces, starting with the granddaddy of them all, which is climate change, and moving down through the scale, through hunger and drought, environmental pollution, even down to overcrowded cities, as we've discussed. So, that really is the initial aim of this, is just to get that awareness level up, and then for governments themselves to start pulling through in terms of this technology and getting the technology to where it's needed.
Well, that sounds great, and I'm sure it will. It's funny in a way. Not only is this the moment for the call, such a call to action, but there is the opportunity when people are not idle, but so many people are not working full tilt, certainly not going to the office anymore, to start talking and sharing these ideas. So the plan now, I think, as I understand it, hopefully we're talking to each other today, but we will be talking again to each other, but with other folks. So is that the idea now, is to sort of start that discussion, to move it forward to talking to people within the industry, people within interest groups around this whole subject?
Yeah, what we at NCW are doing is starting a conversation, and it's a top-down, bottom-up conversation. So from the top down, we'll be interviewing all manner of people with these big, important views and ideas on cross-sectoral approaches to global challenges. And the key here, I think, is this cross-sector term. We, most of all, are not looking simply to the aerospace and defence community to solve these challenges. That's totally unrealistic. There is locked up knowledge, of course, and deployed knowledge, far more importantly, amongst a range of sectors who are already working in the global challenges space. So what we've got to do, I think, is start a sort of much more of a cross-sector dialogue amongst, in the energy sector, oil and gas, aerospace and defence for sure, IT, telecoms, all of these sectors need to come together, have this dialogue. How do we broker these cross-sector solutions and put aerospace and defence in there as well? Because this big sort of key skill aerospace and defence has, as we've discussed, is this stitching together capability, this systems integration capability, which I think is hugely needed and necessary when you're dealing with a big system of systems like the planet Earth. So that's the top-down approach. From the bottom up, we want to see this conversation proliferate through social media and on the internet. And sure, it's not going to be popular with everyone. We're realists. We know that it's going to attract some criticism, but we want to start the dialogue. We want to ensure that this is not something that is just ignored and put on the shelf, so that when we come out of the current crisis we're in, we can not only have the conversation, but also recognize that across the aerospace and defense industry, there's probably trillions of dollars of locked up capability, which not only can go to act on these global challenges, but actually can stimulate global economies in a much needed way as we come out of the pandemic. So, let's have the conversation, top down, bottom up. I'm inviting, as you know, John, captains of industry, government insiders, academics, all to get involved in this conversation, either through us or through some other medium, we'd love to interview you. We'd love to interview them about this topic and see what they think, and then move the conversation on.